This episode is a supplement to regular Inside Israel News episodes. I'll be discussing background related to current events in Israel and the Middle East. Captain's Log Supplemental. The supplement is about the structure of the Israeli government. I had a few questions of people asking about term limits, length of terms, things of that nature, and I thought this would be a great opportunity just to go ahead and address the whole thing. Lately, episodes have been about elections in Israel, so discussing the structure of the Israeli government beforehand, or at least as part of a supplement to regular episodes, makes some sense. So I'll go ahead and offer that here, and we'll go ahead and fill that void. I'm going to use some basic and general language. There's a very different political language that is used when discussing multi-party proportional parliamentary systems that we don't use in the U.S., and words that mean different things in foreign politics than they do here. And I've discussed that in other episodes as well. So I'll try to define terms as best I can as I go along. I may forget to, and if I do, you can always ask me about it later. I may end up defining it somewhere. And it's my hope that in the long run I'll be able to do maybe a couple of YouTube videos or something kind of explaining the differences between presidential and parliamentary systems in general, which will then give me an opportunity to fill in some of those blanks and talk about some of the crazy ways these things are similar or different in their different areas. But that's a talk for another time. So I'll begin with the Israeli judicial system because it's the most similar to ours, and also it'll be a chance to get that out of the way. Some judicial reforms have been proposed, so as I refer to those, it'll be helpful to have the background of the way the courts work, and then I'll move on to discussing the elected institutions and work my way down from there. The Israeli court system is headed by a Supreme Court, which has 15 members. Members of the court are appointed by the president from a list of judges who are declared qualified to serve on the Supreme Court by a committee, the Judicial Committee of the Knesset. So something similar to what we call the Missouri system in the United States and a number of states in the U.S. where a committee or a commission maintains a list of qualified judges, and governors can choose from that list of qualified judges. And that allows it narrows the choices in terms of judicial nominees for the governor to very qualified people. So we've had problems with states in the past where the governor will appoint his cousin or his brother or her nephew or whatever to the Supreme Court and be like, hey, now you've got a great job. So to prevent that kind of nepotism or the appointment of incompetent judges on a political basis, there is a process that where, again, a commission or committee prepares lists of qualified people. Well, that's how Israel works. It is one of the few actual powers of the presidency, as I'll discuss in just a minute, to appoint the justices of the Supreme Court. Justices of the Supreme Court serve during good behavior until they turn 70, which is the retirement age in Israel for judges. They can be removed by the Knesset if they are impeached and removed for whatever reason. And otherwise, their rotation is, and they serve until they're 70 or until they resign, retire, or are removed, right? And basically, you could say it's for life, except that they do happen to have a retirement age. And as people are living longer and healthier and if the Knesset so chose, they could also raise that age and say, well, we're going to move that to 75. Or if lifespans are not increasing, then they could lower it if they so desired. Beneath the Supreme Court, Israel has a number of appellate courts and also what we would call district courts, but the main courts, also municipal courts and what have you. These courts in Israel operate under the English common law, very much like that of the United States. While in the U.S., of course, we have our own precedents and such, the framers who built our system built it on the body of legal principles that were provided by the common law, one of which, of course, being stare decisis, which is precedent. So when the Supreme Court decides something, that precedent is binding on all lower courts, right? And the lower courts then follow the precedents set by higher courts until those higher courts change the precedents, right? So the legal principles that we have, from the statute of frauds to various principles about civil liberties and justice, and that sort of thing, those are very similar in Israel. And they are very keen to maintain civil liberties and very conscious of the civil liberties issue, because unlike our system where we just assume that, well, you have a Bill of Rights and you have the right to remain silent and so on and so forth, in Israel this is not quite so certain, not quite so fixed. So when you're voting for political parties, when you're voting that kind of thing, thinking about who's going to be appointing your judges and that sort of thing, you really have to think about where they stand on civil liberties, and you really have to question them about that. And it's a point that I made about some of the political parties in Israel. There are political parties in Israel that sometimes sit in the Knesset who have some very different views of civil liberties and civil rights. And some of them, for example, might argue that certain groups of people should have different rights from other people, or special privileges before the law, and so on and so forth. So this is where this is where some of that tension comes from in Israel. Now, the judicial system is independent of the Knesset. The degree of independence of the judiciary in parliamentary systems varies by system. Britain and the United States have very highly independent judiciaries. The United States infamously so, as we're very aware. Our courts are very, very independent at all levels, federal, state, and such, from the elected officials. Again, operating under precedent and under legal principles. In Israel, they're somewhat independent, but of course, they operate under the basic law, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and they operate under the common law, for example, but also by the statutes that are passed by the Knesset. Generally speaking, in most parliamentary systems, the idea is that the court should be servient to the laws passed by the Knesset. And that's important to the degree of democracy, right? The people elect the parliament, and therefore, when it comes to the law, certain legal principles accepted, the law really should serve the public need. And so if the people decide, for example, that something should be illegal, and they elect people who decide that they make a law that should be illegal, the general feeling is that the courts should enforce that law, unless it really goes against the grain of some major legal principle. Now, here in the United States, we're familiar with our courts who strike down laws all the time at the state and federal level that were passed by the legislatures and signed by the governor or the president because of legal principles or the Bill of Rights or what have you. We're familiar with that, but this is much more rare in Israel. And generally speaking, the Knesset's law prevails. And there's a lower degree of case law. There are cases in the U.S. where instances like, for example, some of our proprietary laws, patent law about software, what have you, there are whole bodies of law that are built really out of these quirky case laws, just different cases that came up and haven't really been legislated on or amended by the legislature, the Congress, or what have you, for a long time. And so case law emerges out of that, where basically the courts are creating law on a subject where it would not have existed otherwise if the courts had not decided. That's very uncommon in parliamentary systems. Generally speaking, the courts will enact the law as it is written, and they may adjust it here or there, or if there's certain parts of it that they feel go against certain legal principles, they'll make adjustments. There's a series of judicial reforms. Ayelet Shaked has proposed one set of reforms, and I've talked about how this is one of my biases, I support these reforms, that seeks to challenge some of the independence of the court. Not greatly, just a little bit, to kind of push the court back into the realm of doing more what the people want, less judicial activism, you might say. In America, that's a catch term. However, judicial activism like we have in the U.S. doesn't exist so much in Israel. The kind of judicial activism we're talking about is judges getting a little too full of themselves and a little bit off course, taking cases and deciding things that are kind of outside the purview of the courts, very much like we're familiar with, but to a lesser degree. In any case, these reforms include changing the way some judges are appointed and generally trying to limit the courts to the political will of the people a little more. And I'll just say Israel has been a left-wing country for a very long time. And so a lot of its justices, a lot of its courts are made up of people who are appointed by the left. Well, now, as you can see, for a number of years here, Israel has been electing right-wing governments and right-wing parties to the Knesset. So there's some of that back and forth between the government and the courts that is purely legal, where the courts are rightly mandating changes in the law requiring the government to comply with legal principles, and there are some decisions that are political. And so the aim of the reforms is to reduce political decisions by judges who disagree with the government's policy, the elected government's policy, rather than have a real legal case to make, real principle at stake. In any case, there are a number of different proposals there, and as I said, I'll be talking about some of those as they become relevant in the political discourse ahead. A couple of other things about the courts. Something I find unique about Israel, and something that I really love, Israel has a whole separate court system for various religious groups. These are religious courts. There are Jewish religious courts, Muslim religious courts, Baha'i religious courts, Druze religious courts. There are religious courts established for every major religion, even for different Christian sects that exist in Israel. And so when you go before a court, you have a choice between going before a religious court or a secular court. And that has some value. As a religious person myself, if, let's say, my wife and I were having a divorce, we could both choose to go to a religious court to have that done, or we could go to a secular court to have that done. And obviously, if you're a believer, if both parties are believers, they're going to want the religious court to settle it. And obviously, there are some disputes that will arise out of religious issues in general. So, for example, the secular courts may have nothing to say about ritual cleanliness. If I make a claim that I want to divorce my wife because she will not maintain ritual cleanliness laws according to Jewish custom of whatever Jewish group I'm a part of, and that might be an issue I might want to address with the religious courts, because the civil courts, the secular courts, are going to be like, that's not a problem. Right. I mean, from the secular court point of view, that's not a matter of secular law. Right. And likewise, that if you're living in an Arab community in Israel and you're a Muslim, you can go before courts that implement a very moderate and modern version of Sharia law that is permitted. And that way, again, they can address religious issues there. And as an example, the Muslims in the Middle East, many do continue to practice polygamy, for example, and they are able to go before their own courts with their own imams to address issues that pertain to that, whereas secular courts and secular law don't recognize polygamy. We have, our Anglo-American common law legal system is built around the concept of marital monogamy, right? So this allows these different groups who live differently and have different cultural values and different religious values to address those problems within their own community. And likewise, if a person feels, let's say, going before a religious court, if I'm raising issues like I just said, for example, about ritual cleanliness laws or what have you, and my wife doesn't feel that the religious courts would give her a fair hearing, she has recourse to the secular courts as well. She can go out there and say, well, my husband's being unreasonable, he just wants to divorce me because he likes some other lady, and they could end up in the civil courts in a very different legal system. So that option is there. And that's a beautiful thing about Israel. Israel takes religious freedom to the nth degree and really wants people not only to have the right to practice their religion, but also to live how they please and to seek justice within their own religious belief systems to the degree that can be allowed and tolerated in a modern society. So that is one beautiful thing about Israel. There's a question I'm frequently asked when I go out and speak about Israel or talk about Israeli politics, and this one comes up quite frequently, especially here in the United States. Does Israel have a constitution? The answer is yes and no, but mostly no, which is about as oversimplified as I can make it. When Israel's first Knesset was elected, the idea was Of course, Israel had a war to fight first and foremost. But once the war had come to an armistice by 1949, the idea was that the First Knesset was going to go ahead and write a constitution. And so they designed the Knesset with this multi-party proportional system so that every demographic group, every constituency in Israel could be represented at what would become a constitutional assembly that would draft a plan of government. And so they elected the Knesset, the Knesset got off to doing its business, and they never really got around to writing a constitution. And so the Knesset, as it exists now, has become the core of the government. They did draft what is called a basic law, and that is a set of laws that outline the structure of the government and some of the basics of the government's layout and rules about how elections are held and that sort of thing. Germany likewise has a basic law, but unlike our constitution, it is much easier to amend. In Israel, amendments to the basic law require an absolute majority of the Knesset. So you can't just have a majority of a quorum. Let's just say you have to have an absolute majority. It takes 61 votes to amend the basic law. And it's been done a few times. Obviously, Israel has pursued a number of different structural changes, right? But Israel does not have a constitution. So unlike our constitution, where we measure everything legally against the constitution and say, does this meet the constitutional standard for the freedom of speech and expression? Does this meet the constitutional standard for the right of assembly? These kinds of things. What does the Constitution say about the impeachment of the president and the trial of the president and that sort of thing? We lean on the Constitution. The Constitution, in our political theory, belongs to the people. It is the people's document, and therefore it is kind of set against the government. The government has to obey the Constitution because in so doing it is obeying the popular will, protecting the people from harm to their rights, liberties, freedoms, and that sort of thing. We believe in the idea of limited government, where government exists to act and exercise powers that we, the people, believe it should have. At least that's how the country was founded, let's put it that way. In Israel, they have a little bit different conception. The government exists to govern, and it can do almost anything the elected majority wants to do. I don't want to say it's pure democracy because, as I just described with the court system, there are legal principles, civil liberties, and limits to what the government can do. But at the end of the day, the basic legal structure of Israel falls on what is essentially at the core of most Western political systems, and that is salus populi ex suprema lex. The needs of the people are the supreme law. At the end of the day, what the people want is what is done, or they don't want to have constitutional constraints, let's say, that prevent the government from doing something that the people consider necessary in any given circumstance. Whereas over here in the United States, we might say that we would rather suffer the ills of people not responding to public safety needs or criminals going free, rather than that people should be put upon or oppressed, or that innocent people should go to prison unnecessarily, right? So this is a little bit different way of thinking about government. So again, when it comes to elections, when you think about it, if the people you elect can do almost anything, you have to be awfully skeptical, suspicious, and careful about whom you elect to lead that system. And honestly, I wish people would be a little bit more skeptical and a little bit more suspicious over here when you just, go down your ballot and, oh, that's my congressman. I'll just vote for the incumbent, keep him there, keep her there, whatever. I wish people would take the time to go and look it up and what's this person's record on civil rights, on civil liberties, on freedom of speech, on whatever rights are important to you especially. There's some that are important to all of us. In any case, there's a little bit more scrutiny in Israel of people, politicians, political leaders, and political parties on these issues. And so sometimes you'll see people criticizing a political party for its civil liberties record, right, where you wouldn't see that as much. I mean, you could argue specific politicians or specific judges may have made a bad decision here in the U.S. or contributed. You hear people debate that and argue that endlessly, but we don't generally sit there and say, well, this political party is against civil liberties. It can happen, There are some people who say certain things. But at the end of the day, in Israel, they do have to be very concerned about these things. Anyway, so the basic law is the structure under which the government is formed and operated. It can be amended by an absolute majority of the Knesset, and it is relatively flexible. And while the courts do adhere to the principles, legal principles of the common law, for the most part, the Knesset is free to act on behalf of the people, to address any emergency, any need, to write any law, to make any changes necessary to serve the people who elect them. And basically the punishment, if you will, for failing to fulfill that promise is that you'll be voted out of office. And any government that loses popularity because it didn't handle a crisis properly can be tossed out at any time, as I'm about to describe here in a few minutes. On to the Israeli presidency. I'm going to be very brief here. Parliamentary systems grew out of the British system. And so ultimately in the British system, you have what Walter Bagehot, the great definer, if you will, who wrote down the differences between the old British system and the new parliamentary system in the mid-19th century. Walter Bagehot described government as being between the dignified and the efficient. The dignified being the monarchy, the head of state, a ceremonial role that someone who represents all the people, who stays above the fray of politics and doesn't involve him or herself in the daily ritual of governing the country, while the efficient, that is the cabinet, elected by Parliament, the elective government, runs the daily affairs and deals with the politics. The dignified and the efficient. Well, because that is the basis of parliamentary government, parliamentary systems tend to have a separate head of state, or what we call a dual executive. And the split executive, or dual executive, involves having a president, or it could be called any number of different things. Obviously, in Britain, they continue to have a monarch, but there is a president who holds that head of state ceremonial position, and then the prime minister who actually runs the government. So when I say the president of Israel, like the president of Germany, like the president of the Czech Republic, a number of different places, this is a presidency that does not hold much power. There are a few interesting powers, but it doesn't hold much power. Originally, the president of Israel was elected to 5-year terms and could serve up to 2 terms. But there was a problem. There was a president who was found to be corrupt, and 2 years into his second term, around the year 2000, he was ousted from the presidency after 7 years in office. And so it was decided at that point that they would change the nature of the office, that the presidency would serve a 7-year term, and that the person holding that office would be limited to a single term of office. 7-year terms for presidents aren't that uncommon. The president of France used to be a 7-year term. They shortened that to 5 to make it coincident with parliamentary elections in France a few years back. But in a number of countries, a 7-year term is fairly common. Curiously, when the Virginia Plan was first presented in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, the original plan was to have a president with a 7-year term elected by Congress. So 7-year terms happen, and when they do, they're for presidents who are symbolic heads of state who do not wield actual power in the government. Now, the Israeli presidency has the role of performing certain ceremonies, state functions, state dinners, and that sort of thing. The president of Israel tends to travel and do different events with different demographics and groups in Israel, and there's always something interesting going on with the office, but it has very few real powers. Well, let's talk about what those powers are. As I've described above, the president does have the power to choose individual justices to nominate to the Supreme Court, who have to be approved by the Knesset, from a group of qualified judges who are provided by the Justice Committee. Now, that is one power. The president also has the power to appoint the head of the Bank of Israel, likewise from the list of qualified candidates. But that's not going to be too much of a problem. Israel has many good qualified financial advisors and financial leaders, and the Bank of Israel has been competently led for some time. That is another important power. The president does have a little bit of power of the bully pulpit. As the leader of the country, The president can speak out from time to time in favor of this or against that, but usually, as Walter Bagehot described, the dignified versus the efficient, the dignified stays out of politics and sort of takes on larger missions or larger jobs. The closest thing in our American political system that I can describe to this is like the First Lady, or potentially the First Gentleman. This is a person who has a ceremonial role and doesn't do a whole lot. I guess the Vice President sort of fits into that category, although in recent years it has been the custom of the last two presidents, Presidents Trump and Biden, to rely more heavily on their vice presidents to assist with government and lead task forces and to take certain actions. It has not been the case with past administrations so much. There are a few exceptions, like Dick Cheney, who was pretty active during the Bush years, but for the most part, the vice president is a ceremonial role with just a few powers and otherwise goes around and reads books in kindergartens, doesn't do a lot. Similar to the First Lady or First Gentleman office as well. Well, the President of Israel does that for the most part. There is one very important power that accompanies the presidency, and that we're going to be discussing in depth after the election. And you'll hear a lot from me about it. The president does have the power to nominate a candidate for prime minister. Once an election has been held, when the new Knesset is sworn in, the first thing that the candidates do is make recommendations for prime minister. So parties will vote, in essence, but voice their preference for who should be prime minister. And that has a lot of influence on the system. So, for example, as we're about to see, the so-called right bloc is about to be about 2/3 of the Knesset. A large number of those are going to vote to recommend Bibi Netanyahu to be prime minister. Some of them are going to give their preference to Gideon Sa'ar, right, to a competitor. The center-left may also choose to recommend Gideon Sa'ar, or they might choose to prefer Yair Lapid instead. There could be a number of different choices. Based on these recommendations, the president makes the nomination. And what usually happens is the party that is generally understood to be the winner of the election, they are generally the party whose leader is recommended to be prime minister, and the president usually nominates that person. There's very little controversy about it, usually. There are exceptions, and one exception I'm about to talk about. In 2007, when Kadima led the Knesset, they elected Shimon Peres to be president, and he served as president of Israel for 7 years. I've mentioned that Shimon Peres was prime minister on 2 occasions beforehand and was widely regarded as an elder statesman. He was one, along with Golda Meir, part of that generation who were young when Israel was founded. And so you could call them the young founding generation, sort of similar to the James Madisons, Rufus Kings, and Alexander Hamiltons of America's founding. That generation that lived on for many decades into the country's founding rather than just being there and being an elder statesman at the time that the country was actually established. So Shimon Peres was an honored statesman and a prominent political leader, so he was elected president. In the 2009 election, technically speaking, Kadima won the election by earning 28 seats. They earned the largest parliamentary bloc. But while Likud had fallen 1 seat shy of them at 27 seats, the fact is the right bloc, or the parties generally associated with the political right, had won more seats than those parties generally associated with the left, or the left bloc. Right bloc and left bloc are important. Stepping back from Israel, this is an important type of language when talking about multi-party proportional systems and even some majoritarian systems. I won't even go into the differences between the two right here. But in multi-party proportional systems, that becomes a very important thing, because when you have a dozen political parties, or even 5 or 6 political parties, you have to divide those, kind of generally speaking, to those who are generally understood to be on the right and those who are generally understood to be on the left. And this is where terminology like right bloc and left bloc come from. So as I described before, describing political parties, right? Likud, Yisrael Beitenu, Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party, Naftali Bennett's Yamina Party, the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties. These are parties that are generally understood to be on the right, and therefore they are the right bloc. Labor, Yesh Atid, Blue and White, Meretz, these are parties understood to be on the left bloc. And likewise, the Arab parties are generally understood to be left bloc, as most of them are predominantly sort of socialist in their outlook economically. But generally speaking, the right bloc, left bloc was defined on national security grounds, and so the left bloc were the generally dovish parties, and the right bloc were the generally hawkish parties. Well, it doesn't quite apply anymore. In any case, in 2009, the right bloc recommended Netanyahu to be prime minister, and therefore Shimon Peres appointed or nominated or offered the first chance to form a coalition to Bibi Netanyahu. Now, we've just seen that Israel is on its fourth election now. What happens when that person who's nominated to be prime minister fails to form a government? And that is a fascinating question. In that case, sometimes the person who received the second greatest number of votes to serve as prime minister can also be nominated by the president at the president's discretion to have a go at forming a government. Generally speaking, when an election's been held, there's understood to be a 45-day deadline to form a coalition government. Again, that coalition must be made up of a majority of parties, right? You have to have parties who hold a majority of seats in the Knesset, 61 out of 120 seats. So if you have 61 seats, you have a government. If you fall short of that, you don't, right? So you could get all the way up to 60 seats, and it's happened before. You can get all the way up to 60 seats and not have that 61st seat. You're stuck, right? So the first go-round back in 2019, Bibi Netanyahu won, and his coalition partners won more seats than any other competing coalition, but Netanyahu was not able to form a majority. And so the president at the time, Ruby Rivlin, or I should say Reuven Rivlin, but everyone calls him Ruby. He said, Benjamin Netanyahu, nobody calls him Benjamin. He's Bibi to everyone. This is one of the wonderful things about a small country. Everybody's a nickname, right? Nobody's actually called by their name. And when they serve in the military, as everyone in Israel does, people get nicknames that carry through for their lifetime after that. So those can be kind of funny. In any case, Ruby Rivlin is the president of Israel, and he nominated Netanyahu, and then after Netanyahu failed to form a government, he nominated Benny Gantz, General Benny Gantz, to try, and Benny Gantz was not able to form a government. And after trying both sides, it was then very clear that there was a hung parliament, another parliamentary term, meaning that no government could be formed, and new elections were held. And we went through this process again, and new elections were held, right? So there were 3 elections, right? Two in 2019, one in early 2020. And it was after that election that ultimately Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz came to terms to form a unity government to address the virus crisis and carry Israel through the rest of 2020. That government fell apart, and as a result, Israel is now having its 4th election. So the ability to nominate prime ministers, the ability to have a say in how the coalition forming process goes is an important part of the powers of the presidency. And there's a little bit of discretion there. I mean, did Ruby Rivlin have to give Benny Gantz a chance to form a coalition? Not necessarily, right? He could have just said, Bibi couldn't form a coalition, new election time, right? So there's considerable discretion there. But generally that is guided by the parties in the Knesset. The president doesn't just pick there and say, well, the right bloc won more seats, but I'm going to go ahead and give the left bloc the first go at forming a government. This is based on which parties have recommended whom to be prime minister. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that Ruby Rivlin was elected president narrowly in the contest in 2014, which you can read about if you go to insideisrael.news on my website and look at articles I've written in the past. I wrote about the elections for president in 2014, several articles for Times of Israel, at least one of which was a featured article, along with writers like Yair Lapid, very, very proud of that I had my article about the presidency, and then the next day it was Yair Lapid who had the featured article from the blog. So that was a good event. In any case, in 2021, Israel this summer will be electing a president again. Ruby Rivlin, having served one full term, is no longer eligible to serve as president, so it's anybody's guess who's going to be president. There are a number of eligible elder statesmen and elder stateswomen out there who could serve in that role, but it's not clear who's going to have it. Now, typically speaking, the governing coalition forms a block, right? There's 61 votes. That's a majority of the Knesset. Those are the votes necessary to elect the president. You have to have a majority, just like to change the basic law. An absolute majority of the Knesset is required. Well, they generally form together around a candidate. It happened in 2014. Israel's center-right coalition, which had the center-left Yesh Atid party in the coalition, did not have the votes to elect Ruby Rivlin president. And Bibi Netanyahu and Ruby Rivlin are long-time rivals. Two men do not get along, do not like each other, and Bibi Netanyahu did not want Ruby Rivlin to be president. So I'll give you the short of it. Bibi actually proposed changing the basic law to extend Shimon Peres' term for a year, and he even proposed a direct election for the president. But he could not find the political will to have either of those things done, and ultimately Ruby Rivlin was the coalition's candidate. Well, the center-left was really wise to what was going on, and they ran an elder statesman of the center-left with the Kadima party named Meir Sheitrit. Sheitrit almost won the election, and he came dangerously close to being president of Israel, even though he did not have the support of the governing coalition. What a coup that would have been. And just at the last minute, Elkin, the head of the coalition, the coalition chair, was able to whip the votes to get enough votes to make Ruby Rivlin president. So that was a really exciting presidential election. Well, we could be in store for another exciting presidential election. Imagine for a moment, if you will, if no government is formed from this election. Right? If Bibi Netanyahu has a large block of seats that are aligned with him, but he does not come up with a majority, and Yair Lapid and Gideon Sa'ar, either together or separately, are likewise unable to come up with a majority, and another election is going to be held, right? Which would be probably in the late summer, perhaps early fall. That would be after the July presidential election. If there's a hung parliament and no governing coalition, no majority, what's going to happen to the presidential election? Will Bibi Netanyahu be able to get his choice elected president by working together with Gideon Sa'ar or someone else to help find the votes to elect the president? Or will the center-left come together and bring together some of the center-right candidates around someone that they could give the presidency to? Now, I did mention, of course, Yair Lapid is going to be something of a problem for any attempt to form a coalition for Gideon Sa'ar, right? Because Lapid is going to come out with more seats in the Knesset, and his votes are going to be necessary to form a center-right, center-left-based coalition that does not include Likud's votes or the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties that are loyal to Bibi Netanyahu, or even the far-right party. So he could be in the way of a Gideon Sa'ar government. Will Gideon Sa'ar offer Yair Lapid the presidency in order to get him out of the way? Or will Yair Lapid prefer to try to say, hey, Gideon Sa'ar, why don't you become the president and I'll be prime minister? This could be really interesting to see how this goes down. But if there's no government, it's anyone's game. The presidency of Israel will be wide open. Or, likewise, to avoid the whole problem, the Knesset could vote by majority just to go ahead and have a direct presidential election, like one that we'd be familiar with. Everyone would vote for president. Every party would put up a candidate. The two candidates who received the greatest number of votes would go to a runoff, assuming no one achieved a majority in the first round. The parties would go to a runoff, and those two would face off, and whoever wins a majority wins. That was what Bibi proposed last time, and he wanted to buy another year in order to do it. Well, if no coalition agreement comes out of this Knesset, there's going to be some need to do something about the presidency, and that could be fun. We'll see. This concludes part 1 of the supplement on the structure of the Israeli government. For more about the Knesset, the cabinet, and local governments, see part 2. With that, I will say להתראות, goodbye.
אולי נפליגה בספינות מחוף אילת עד חוף של הר, ועל המשחטות הישנות יטעינו תפוחי זהב.